let's see. In this talk, we'll be connecting two things. So first of all, a bit of philosophy, so epistemology of knowledge how, discussing philosophy, and then the automated planning in AI. So this planning is one of the subfields of AI. So AI is not only about machine learning, but there are also other subfields, and automated planning is one of them, important one. Okay, so the way to connect these two is via the logic of knowing how. Say, Julius introduced earlier. So I've been working on logics of knowing WH for quite a long time. So the logic of knowing how is sort of the bridge of these two between philosophy and AI. Okay, so more precisely what we are going to do is to connect AI planning and knowing how in a bidirectional kind of connection. So first of all, we will be doing planning-based know-how. So we will use the idea of automated planning in AI to help us to understand better about the semantics of knowing how expressions. And then we will go the other way around. So we will be using the formalized knowing how to do AI planning with some more complicated goals and more interesting scenarios. So that's the general idea of this talk. Okay, so here is the, sorry, there is something wrong with the, yeah. Okay, so there are some warnings. So since I've been talking about some kind of interdisciplinary work, so for different audience, they may expect different things. But I have to warn you that I won't demonstrate any kind of a practical AI problems because this work, at least at this stage, is theoretical in general. So this is sort of theoretical foundation for applications in AI. But I'm also looking forward to collaborations with more AI researchers to make actual practical tools to apply the theoretical framework we develop for real applications. And also for philosophers, we will be talking about, we'll be touching some philosophical questions, but they are not the focus of this talk. As you will see, by having certain logical framework, we can raise new philosophical questions, but the point of the talk is not to answer them. We'll be focusing on the connection between philosophy and AI using the logic as the bridge. And also as a logician, actually we have, maybe you know the logicians are good at manipulating symbols, and we have a lot of like mathematical looking, say, well, content. So I would try to minimize the technical content for the general audience because if I understood correctly, this is sort of more public talk. So I will be talking more about ideas, but there will be symbols and the jargon in logic and AI and philosophy, but I will explain them, well, in a more intuitive way. Okay, so this is the outline of the talk. So I will first give some background of this work because we're talking about the three things. So I will briefly introduce these three things: a bit of philosophy, a bit of AI planning, and a bit of epistemic logic of knowing WH, in particular knowing how. And then we will do this bidirectional connection. So from one way to the other and back. So this is the plan of the talk. Okay, let's start with some very brief philosophical discussion. So the literature of epistemology mainly focuses on propositional knowledge, at least in the traditional way. I mean, this propositional knowledge is usually expressed in terms of knowing that phi, that phi is true. And however, knowledge is not only expressed in terms of knowing that, because you will see in everyday life and in academic communications, we often say knowing whether, knowing what, knowing how, why, and so on. If you Google them, I mean, Google these expressions, you will see they are very often used by people in everyday life. So actually the hits of, for example, knowing what or knowing how is roughly, at the same amount like knowing that. So it's really frequently used. And a very natural question is that what kind of knowledge these expressions are expressing? In particular, for a philosopher, we want to know when you say you know why, or when you say you know how to swim, what you are talking about. You must be talking about some kind of knowledge, but what is this kind of knowledge? Are they different from the usual propositional knowledge expressed by knowing that? So this is one of the central questions for philosophers to answer. Well, in recent years, there are more and more discussions about the relationship between knowledge how, I mean, the knowledge expressed by knowing how, and knowledge that. So the most important question is whether this knowledge how can be reduced to knowledge that. So there are two opposing stances to answer these questions among philosophers. For anti-intellectualists, they say no, knowledge how cannot be reduced to knowledge that. For example, knowing how to swim is not a propositional knowledge, clearly. But what is this knowledge how then? So some idea says, well, it's just some kind of ability, right? Knowing how to swim is like, you have the ability to swim. On the other hand, from the intellectualism perspective, some people may also say, well, to some extent, knowledge how can be reduced to knowledge that, especially when you consider some, say, evidence or insights from linguistics. When you consider the formal semantics of knowing how expressions, you will see it's very closely related to knowing that in some very important way. For example, Stanley Williamson famously argued in this line. Okay, so if you are interested in such kind of discussions, you can check the field paper website on this topic. There are a lot of papers about this. Okay, so just give you some taste. Some people, well, in the general audience may think, okay, so why knowledge how is not just ability? I mean, it's rather clear, right? It looks like ability, but there are a lot of examples like, so we have ability to digest, we have abilities to lift some rather light bag, but usually we won't say, I know how to digest, or I know how to lift a 5 kilo bag. It's kind of too trivial, or you don't use your brain for that. Yeah. And there are also many other examples, like, for example, let's see, maybe just by pure luck, some monkey can play some piece of music, but does it know how? Well, you may say, okay, that's by pure luck. So if this monkey just randomly jump on a piano and play a piece of music by accident, well, it doesn't know how. But then what about the well-trained piano monkey? So this monkey can play this piece of music rather nicely every time. But is there a knowledge how well, according to this monkey. Okay. And also there are interesting examples saying, okay, so imagine a pianist just had a accident and he broke his arm. Now, do we say this pianist doesn't know how to play the piano? Well, from the ability sort of account for knowledge how this pianist doesn't have the ability right now to play the piano, but I think many people would agree that the pianist still knows how to play the piano. So there is not a very simple answer whether this knowledge how is simply the ability or this knowledge how it can be easily reduced to knowledge that. Okay, so there are further insights from the philosophical discussions. We'll come back to this. Okay, so this is the first piece of the background. And the second piece is about automated planning in artificial intelligence. Well, in a nutshell, say this planning in AI is just to find a plan to turn something uncertain or false into something certain and true. So basically, the planning problem is you have a goal to realize, and you need to have a plan to realize this goal. So that's the basic idea. And the usual non-trivial planning happens when you have various sources of uncertainty. For example, you may have uncertainty about the initial states, or you may have uncertainty about your observational power, or you are not sure whether when you do something, the consequence is certain. I mean, you may not sure, well, if you try to open the door, maybe it's locked, then you cannot pull it open like this. So depending on the type of uncertainties and whether, and also the type of plan you consider, you may have various notions of planning. You can also imagine, okay, so the type of plan is also important. The easiest plan is just one action, and you can make it more interesting by having linear sequence of actions, or you can have, branching actions. Depending on what you see, you can select different actions to do. So you may have various notions of plan, and accordingly, you have various notions of planning. Yeah. To give you a more concrete idea of planning, let's see some example. Okay, so this is actually a picture of a map near some piece of Great Wall in Beijing. So if you can read Chinese, you can see various places. And if you look closely, there are some English underneath the Chinese, right? Let me enlarge them. Okay, actually, I think this is supposed to be a mistake. So everywhere, the English is not a translation about this Chinese name, but simply you are here. So when imagine a foreigner standing in front of this map, so, well, he or she will be puzzled. So you're sort of everywhere, right? So when you have a map, but you don't know where you are, I mean, it's still troublesome, right? If you want to navigate yourself to go to a certain place, you need to think and probably use some logic, right? To make it more concrete, let's consider this simple example. So imagine a rookie spy sneaking in an enemy building, like in the movies like Mission Impossible or so on. And usually this spy is guided by some headquarters. So he or she has this earphone, and the headquarters will say, okay, so go straight and be careful if someone is coming in, and hide somewhere. But as in those movies, the communication with the headquarters is supposed to be lost at some point, and you're on your own in this enemy building. So now suppose someone spotted this rookie spy and put the alarm. In panic, this spy got lost. Okay, However, this pie has the map of the floor. So this is sort of the abstraction of the map. So you have different places like rooms, and they are connected to with some corridors, maybe some one-way corridor. There are some gates you cannot go back. So this R means from here you can go right to here, and this U means from here you can go upstairs to some other places. And there are some safe, places marked on the map, although in the real building you won't see the safe sign, because safe sign means, okay, there is no video camera, you can safely hide there or something like that. Okay, so because this spy was in panic, so he is currently not sure whether he's at S2 or at S3. Although, well, from the external view, if you're God, you would see, well, he's actually at, this room S3. Yeah, okay. So now the question is, does this spy have a plan to make sure he will be safe? Okay. So you can think about it for a while. So there are some uncertainty. You don't know where you are, but you want to be safe by making a good plan, right? Okay, so what about just going right or going up? Because you're actually here. So when you go right, you'll be safe. When you go up, you will be safe too. But the trouble is, I mean, this spy doesn't know where he is right now, although we know where he is. So he can reasoning like this. So what if I'm here? So if I'm here, then going right, I won't be safe. If I'm here at S2, going up, I won't be safe either. So going right or going up, they are not good plan, given the uncertainty this spy has. But can you think about a good plan to always make sure he will be safe after executing it? Okay, I think you will find one. So one reasonable plan is first go right and then go up. This is a good plan because no matter whether you're here or you're here, going right and up, you will be safe eventually. Right? So this is a good plan given your uncertainty. So to find this kind of plan is the so-called conformant planning in artificial intelligence. And you can formalize this mathematically. You can find a good algorithm to do it fast. So that's the one type of planning in artificial intelligence. We will come back to this running example in our later part of the talk. Okay, so the third background is about epistemic logic, which is some sort of logic to reason about propositional knowledge and belief. Okay, so well, if you know logic, there must be a formal language where you can express some things, some abstract things. Okay, so in epistemic logic, you can express agent I knows that phi. So in this kind of symbol, okay? And of course, you can express more complicated expressions like agent I knows that phi and agent I knows that agent J doesn't know phi. And well, agent J knows that agent I knows phi, or agent I knows not phi, which means agent I knows whether phi. Okay, so you can express all kinds of interesting statements. And you need to give semantics to this, expressions in the logical language. So you have a model and you give truth values for formulas on models. But I won't go into the details, just want to mention that in this picture of epistemic logic, when can you say you know that phi? Okay, so you know that phi if and only if phi is true in all the epistemic alternatives that you cannot distinguish from your actual world. Well, this sounds a little bit abstract. I will just give you a brief example. So, for example, this P says New York, it is raining in New York. However, because I'm standing here in my office in Beijing and I didn't check the weather report, so I can think about two possible situations. One is New York it's raining in New York. The other is it's not raining in New York. And I don't know which one is the real world, right? I cannot distinguish these two. For these two are both fine. So in this case, I don't know that P, right? Okay, so only when you can rule out all the P4's possibilities, you can say you know that P. So that's the idea of the semantics for this epistemic logic. Okay, so while for logic, you also have, say, proof systems, and this is the idealized sort of proof system for, standard epistemic logic, where you have axioms as, well, if something is qualified as knowledge for you, it must be true. And if you know something, then you know that you know something. If you don't know something, then you know that you don't know something. Of course, these axioms are debatable philosophically, and actually, for example, this one is usually called KK principle in philosophy, and you have hundreds of papers discussing whether this is reasonable or not in the literature. And if you are Chinese, you can read this one. This is actually Confucius teaching. So it says, well, if you know it, then you should admit you know it. If you don't know it, then you should admit you don't know it. And that's knowledge. And I think these things are sort of in parallel with these axioms we have, just for fun. Okay, so the standard picture, standard framework of epistemic logic has been successfully applied to not only philosophy, but also theoretical computer science, where people also want to assign knowledge to computers, to distributed systems, to many other artificial agents or machines, and also to AI. Okay. But as we have seen already, knowledge is not only expressed in terms of knowing that, you can say a lot of knowing why, knowing how stuff. And also more interestingly, you can combine them. For example, I don't know how to win the game, but I know that she knows how, and I know why she knows, right? All these things are interesting. So how do we reason about this kind of expressions? There's supposed to be some knowledge, right? So epistemic knowledge, logic is about reasoning about knowledge, but it's not equivalent to reasoning about knowledge expressed by only knowing that. So there are knowing WH expressions. They are also interesting. However, despite early discussions by Hindika, say, logic of knowing WH is seldom discussed in the literature of epistemic logic. So it's a pity. So in the past years, I have been trying to promote a systematic study of this kind of logic. And the one thing you notice from Hindika's early discussion is that when you talk about knowledge that, well, actually propositional modal logic is just enough. But when you move to knowledge WH, you need quantifiers. You need the first order modal logic. For example, when you say knowing who murdered John can be formalized by having this formula. So first of all, there is an existential quantifier. There is someone, and you know that this someone murdered John. So that's the meaning of knowing who murdered John. You can compare with this one when you swap the knowledge operator and the essential quantifier, and it only says you know someone murdered John. So this is exactly the Dirac and Didicto distinction in philosophy. However, by having all the quantifiers and the modality together, you will make trouble. So there are a lot of philosophical and technical troubles for the full first order modal logic language. And especially the computational aspect is really bad. So it sort of blocks its use in many applications. So I try to do better by a sort of a minimalist approach. So instead of having all these quantifiers and the stuff, I try to pack, say, quantifiers and modalities together to have the so-called bundles and to introduce specific modalities for them. So in this way, we can restrict the use of quantifiers and try to balance the expressivity of the logic and the complexity computationally. And it's very natural and succinct to express some interesting properties, and you can have very intuitive axioms and so on. So it also leads to decidable fragments of first order modal logic, some intuitive understanding of non-classical logic like intuitionistic logic, and some new semantics for deontic logic. I don't have time to go into this. So over the years, we have more and more people who are involved in making all kinds of knowing WH logic possible. And we studied knowing whether, knowing what, knowing how, and why. And if you are interested in this kind of ideas, you can check my earlier survey paper here. Okay, now we're ready to see the connection. So we will be using the logic of knowing WH to bridge epistemology and AI planning. So I understood I have like 15 minutes, right? Julius. Okay, so I will try to finish in time. Okay, first of all, from planning to know-how. So we will be using the AI planning idea and some kind of philosophy to formalize what do we mean by knowing how. Okay. Yeah. Okay, so some clarification. So we will be focusing on a particular type of knowing how, which we call goal-directed. So essentially it's knowing how to realize a goal. Like I know how to go to Beijing is to realize the state that I am in Beijing, or I know how to know the answer to realize the goal of knowing the answer and so on. We will not be talking about other so-called activity-directed know-how, like knowing how to swim and so on. And also we don't talk about I know how happy she is, or I know how to behave at the dinner table. Okay. Okay, so there are some observations and ideas from the existing discussions in philosophy for us to, as a logician, to formalize the formal semantics of knowing how. For example, from the intellectualism sort of account, well, Stanley and Williamson famously argue that knowing how to F can be break down into the following. So there is a way W such that it is a way for this agent to F, and this agent knows that this W is indeed a way to do F. And also this agent entertain this proposition under some kind of practical mode of presentation, while intuitively this agent sort of know how to execute this way. Well, actually, yeah. And the other, so you can already see there is some similarity with sort of the Hindikat's view about knowledge WH expressions, because there is a essential quantifier here, and that there are something about know that. and some extra things. We'll be using this idea to give the formal semantics. And also in the literature philosophical discussion, it's very important that if you can just by chance achieving something using some method or ways or plan, is not enough to say you know how. You have to knowingly guarantee the result, right? But how to turn these ideas into rigorous definitions of semantics for the knowing how operator in the logic? That's where we borrow the idea of AI planning. Okay, so in a very, very briefly, Agent I knows how to achieve phi. We write in the logical language KHI phi to be read as knowing Agent I knows how to achieve phi. It roughly means there is some plan. So plan in the sense in AI planning. There is some plan sigma such that this agent I knows that executing this plan will make sure phi. And actually, there are more conditions in AI planning. So you not only knows that, well, executing this plan will make sure phi. Also, you have to know this plan can be executed fully. Okay, so these kind of ideas are implicit in the definitions of, for example, conformant planning in AI. Okay. So if you write it in logical language, so it's roughly this, but we will sort of pack this thing into the unique modality like this, well, rather than introducing quantifiers and so on. Okay. But there are various notions of plans in planning. So there are linear plan, conditional plan, knowledge-based plan, plans with loop, and so on. And there are so many notions of planning correspondingly. So a question would be, okay, whether choosing different notion of plan and the planning will lead to different logic, right? But we'll see under certain condition, they will, well, induce exactly the same logic. Okay, so we what we did in the past, we studied this kind of logic where we can express both know that and know how together and study their computational aspects. Okay, so let's come back to this very simple example we mentioned for planning. So actually, when we ask this question, whether this rookie spy has a good plan to make sure he will be safe, you can also ask simply whether he knows how to be safe. So that's the connection between planning and the, well, know-how stuff. Okay, so as we see already, these RU plan will be good enough for him to be safe. Okay, so, well, intuitively knowing how phi is true in this model, given this uncertainty about the actual position of the agent, well, this is true if and only if there is a linear plan. Well, linear plan is a sequence of actions such that you know that this linear plan is always fully executable and it can get you to some phi world in the end. So you know how to make sure phi means this kind of thing. And you can check this RU thing is always executable no matter whether you go from here or here, and eventually you will be safe. So that's the way we give the semantics to knowing how expressions using the idea of planning. But as we mentioned, there are various different notions of plans, and the linear plan is one of the simplest plan. And the more interesting plan is so-called the conditional plan or branching plan, where you can use conditions to select different branches Like, okay, if I know P, then I do A. If I know Q, then I do B, something like that. And if you take that thing and give a proper semantics, you can have well, we don't have time to go into the semantics, but given a reasonable semantics based on this kind of conditional plan, or you call it strategy-based plan, you will have a nice logic, which is very similar to the standard epistemic logic. So as I mentioned, we have, say, know that operator in the language. And then we also have the usual know that axioms in the ideal, idealized situation. But more interesting is about the interaction between know that and know how. For example, this axiom says, if you know that P, then you know how P. Why? Because you already know P is true. Then you can just select doing nothing as a good plan, right? And for this one, it's also called preferred call. So if you know how to achieve, make sure P, then you know how to make sure that you know P. Because once you can make sure P, then you are sure after doing this, you will know P, right? If you are not forgetful. And this one is introspection for know-how. So if you know how to achieve P, then you know that you know how to achieve P. So for your own know-how, you have introspection. And this is probably the most interesting, signature, say, axiom for know-how. So if you know how to make sure, you know how to make sure P, then you know how to make sure P. This is due to the compositionality of, branching plan. So you can combine two-stage plan into one-stage plan. So something like that. Of course, like in the early days of epistemic logic, we can have all kinds of philosophical discussions about whether these axioms are reasonable, right? For example, like the KK principle. So can you reflect on your own knowledge how? But for me, I think this introspection is a very interesting one because it sort of can tell the difference from knowledge how and merely ability accounts, right? If you have just some ability, maybe you don't know you have this ability, but when you know how, you should be able to reflect on your own knowledge how. I think it's sort of reasonable, but there can be a lot of discussions. And also, this kind of axioms can also tell apart different kinds of know-how. For example, as I mentioned here in this talk, we focus on so-called goal-directed know-how, so know how to realize a goal. But if you allow activity know-how, like knowing how to swim, this axiom will be intuitively invalid. For example, you can say, I know how to make sure in the end I know how to swim by paying big money to the very good trainer for swimming, right? But it doesn't mean I know how to swim right now, right? So these axioms can tell you something about the know-how you want to discuss. But we don't have time to go into the details. So if you're interested, you can look at our paper. Okay, so let's move on. So, in general, you can use a programming language to specify all kinds of plans, like the branching plan or even the plan with loop. For example, this one. This one is kind of a programming. It's a little program says, whenever you know. You don't know that you're out of some maze, you have to do the following. You just keep going forward until you hit some wall. Then you go left, something like this. So you can handle actually plans with loop and so on. So actually in a recent paper published on artificial intelligence, we show that actually 10 different notions of plans and planning if you use them as the idea for defining a know-how operator, you will have the same logic, same know-how logic. So you will see under some very minor assumption, there are some really logic core shared by different kinds of know-how based on different kinds of notions of planning. So it's very interesting. Okay, so well, I have maybe 5 minutes or also, maybe I'll take a little bit more. Okay, so last bit is about from know-how logic to AI planning. Okay. So this direction, well, first of all, we can see because when we give the semantics for our know-how operator, we use the plan. Actually, we can do planning, well, by having the model checking problem for our know-how formula. So actually we can turn a planning problem in artificial intelligence into logic model checking problem in our framework. But this is the most easy part. Okay, we can do much more. Because in AI planning, usually people only focus on planning with factual goals. Like, okay, so I want to be safe. I want to turn this switch on or off. I want to do this and that, but that's all factual. But because in our language, this phi can be really general. It's not only just a factual formula, it can contain other modalities. So we can actually handle much more. So the first thing is we can handle know that goals. Like when you do planning, sometimes you want to make sure the good person knows something, but the bad person doesn't know something, right? That's very reasonable in various applications. You can simply express this goal by some formula in our language, but this is only the beginning. So by just planning with know that goals is, well, this is not just equal to epistemic planning, because we can replace this know that with more general concepts, in particular, know-how. Okay, so in the recent paper, we proposed the so-called higher order epistemic planning. So planning not only with usual know that epistemic goals, but we can have know-how goals. Because the know-how is now in the object language rather than in the meta language. So actually that's the trick of model logic. Model logic takes a meta language concept and bring it into the object language and do the formal things to discuss it. For example, you can say, my goal is to make sure phi, and also to make sure in the future I cannot turn it off. So this is expressed by this thing. And more interestingly, when you have multiple agents, you can make sure, okay, you can make sure phi, and you can also make sure agent 2 doesn't know how to turn it off. And even more, agent 2 knows that agent 1 knows how to turn it off. So you can, well, you may want to have a plan to make sure phi, and agent 2 doesn't know how to turn it off, but well, he or she knows that you can still control this phi, the truth value of phi. And you can have all kinds of interesting things by iterating the know-how operator as the goal of your planning problem. So this is planning with goals about planning itself. In this way, it's called higher order epistemic planning. So here I want to say logical language really matters because, okay, so you can do a lot of things with machine learning and so on, but well, in certain cases, you need the language to specify your goal or other things. Of course, this is not only just specify things. We can show, well, if you do things on explicit models, you can still have a very efficient algorithm to do the model checking for whatever cage formulas in the language. We can still have complete axiomatization over finite models where computer science only care. And the logic is still decidable. And all this will give you computational methods to do higher order planning in reality, although we don't develop tools right now. Okay, so I should conclude in just 1 minute. So let's go back to the beginning of the talk. So in this talk, we try to connect a bit of philosophy with AI, right? Via logic of knowing how as the bridge. So what we actually do is the bidirectional connection. So by using the idea of AI planning, we can formalize know-how in logic. And by use the know-how logic, we can do more planning. So that's the general idea. In the end, I just want to say philosophy and logic still matter in AI, although many things think AI is only about machine learning, especially deep learning, but I think they still matter. And AI can also inspire, say, formal accounts in philosophy and logic. I should stop. Thank you very much.